stand-up, cut-out, a 1913 police special, baton raised. And I thought I must come back later and nick it. However, I had to make a speech that night, which is always an unnerving experience for me, which is why I wanted to speak first here and get it over with. So I ended up a drunken wreck, and this image disappeared from my mind. A couple of weeks later, of course, I remembered it when a certain amount of shit hit the fan. Mike Lee, the city councillor, whose grandfather worked on the wharves, said the figure was a disgrace and should be taken away. Following week, I went down to the Queen's Wharf to have a look. The figure and the plaque that went with it had been removed. Week after this, I had a message from a friend of Mike Lee's asking if I could attend a meeting with a bloke from the Maritime Museum and an employee from the Auckland City Council and Mike, which I did. The bloke from the Maritime Museum and the bloke from the City Council were the ones that had put in place the figure of the police special and then taken it down. They seemed a well-meaning pair, though their gasp on history consisted of saying, people in the past were just like us, you know. This is a sort of a start, but it really doesn't get you very far. Anyway, what their plan had been was a heritage walk along Queen's Wharf, where you would see cut-out effigies of real people from the past and read background information on them. This was to be called Lovers of Auckland. This was to be the theme, something inclusive. I've got a note here, make inclusive gesture with arms. So Lovers of Auckland was people who loved Auckland. When they came to one of the major historic events of waterfront history, the strike of 1913, the bloke from the Maritime Museum and the employee of the City Council looked around for something representative and came up with the figure of the police special. Captured by their theme, they described him as a fellow lover of Auckland, with a plaque saying more or less, as Mike Lee and I pointed out, that this man loved Auckland so much he came down to the wharves and beat a whole lot of other Aucklanders' bloody heads in. We all agreed that perhaps the 1913 display needed a bit of balance. I went away and as a starting point wrote something for the two Heritage Walk blokes to consider. What I wanted to do was put the focus back on the strike. So I wrote this. On the 8th of November 1913, 800 mounted specials armed with revolvers, batons and axe handles cleared Quay Street, just behind us here, of striking watersiders and occupied the wharves. The reaction of the specials, the reaction to the specials' action was immediate. General strike in Auckland headlined the Auckland Star. Seamen, labourers, carpenters, drivers, bricklayers, harbour board employees, shipwrights, tinsmiths, restaurant workers all joined in with the watersiders. Timber workers followed, then furniture workers, brewery workers, painters, engine drivers, jockeys. The central city was at a complete standstill. Hotel guests were cooking their own meals. A strike committee was handing out groceries from the basement at the Trades Hall. The building is still there in Hobson Street. And erected a huge marquee out the back where meals were cooked and served. There were parades and mass meetings. Strikers assembled at Victoria Park gave a huge cheer to marching waitresses. But the biggest cheer of all was reserved for striking newspaper delivery boys. And that's what I sent off to the men from the Council and the Maritime Museum, and I added that if they wanted an effigy, a cut-out figure, maybe they should show one of those striking newspaper delivery boys. It would appeal to a younger audience, I think, inclusive. Haven't heard back. Anyway, Mike has actually asked me to talk about some of the personalities of the 1913 strike, but I thought I'd start off with those non-personalities: drivers, bricklayers, brewery workers, waitresses, newsboys and the jockeys. The women workers. At the time, rents, food and footwear prices were soaring, hitting families and those on low incomes. So daughters and wives of working class families were increasingly moving into the industrial workforce. This was the rank and file, They were the ones who made up the numbers. I'll now look at some of the personalities of that strike. One in particular, Tom Barker. Tom Barker was a young English worker who arrived here in 1909. He'd been born to a family of farm labourers in the furthest north of England, had run away to Liverpool, joined the army, then taken a job as a tram conductor, bridling at the conditions of work. The memoirs he dictated in 1963 describe the spectacular fashion he farewelled Liverpool's trams, pulling off his bell punch and his bag full of pennies, jamming them on the head of an inspector and exclaiming, "You take the bloody thing, I'm off to New Zealand next week, so you can go to hell and so can the trams too." He was 22 when he arrived in Auckland. What he found was a city in transformation. At the turn of the century, Auckland was a relatively quiet colonial town run by the city's dignitaries and business leaders. Politics was a preserve of the Liberal and Tory parties. There was no Labour Party. There was a weak trade union movement. A tiny socialist party was about to start up, but that was about it. That was that first decade, though, of the 20th century saw Auckland changing. The port had been disgorging unprecedented numbers of immigrant workers with as few allegiances as they had belongings. They were largely young, restless men pouring into the inner city. They gathered between Newton Gully and the waterfront, and inner city bummery, shifting around boarding houses and cheap eateries. Rooms in dingy cottages with verandas almost touching, paling fences broken up for firewood, chooks out the back. They took the tram to the brothels of Upper Queen Street, to the Pakapoo saloons and opium dens in Graves Ave, the pawn shops, the pubs, Salvation Army Citadel. They bought fresh mackerel caught at the end of the wharf, went to the races, went on the cadge. Saturday afternoon they turned their backs on rugby union and watched the league. Saturday nights in their worn, going out suits and hats, they cheered the drunks in Queen Street and abused the cops. Tom Barker took a room in Ponsonby, a working class district he described as wooden houses with outside toilets that the night soil man cleaned once a week. He checked out the Ponsonby depot of the American-owned Auckland Electric Tramway Company. The job was going as a conductor, he took it. He believed in unionism as a means of bettering conditions at work. He joined the Tramways Union. Some of the union members belonged to the Socialist Party. They took him along to a meeting. Here was the second transformation of Auckland. For it wasn't only able bodies that the port had been bringing into the inner city. It had been bringing in, by way of books, pamphlets, speakers and agitators, the idea of socialism. John A. Lee, later the Labour MP for Grey Lynn, recalled the Auckland waterfront in those days was a location of world evangelism. Great strikes in the United States would send agitators out across the Pacific for a cooling off period. Quay Street, street behind us here, pulsated with contention as a voice outlawed in the USA at the beginning of the month would talk from a Quay Street soapbox by the end. In meeting halls and working men's clubs, in radical newspaper offices and bookshops, on Sundays outside the town hall, the labouring masses began to hear their own exultation. They ploughed the prairies, they built the cities, they dug the mines, they made the workshops, they laid the railroad. Why then were they powerless? Where did power lie? Everywhere Tom Barker found people around Auckland holding meetings on socialism and on religion. At that time, he remembered, Auckland, being so far away from the world, had very little entertainment. People had to make their own interests, and so, for the time and place, Auckland was a very active place politically. Photos of the period show large crowds gathered outside the Socialist Party Hall in Wellesley Street, close to the casino site, and a stunning crowd of 12,000 gathered of a Sunday to listen to a Socialist Party speaker outside the Auckland Town Hall. Socialist Party had been formed in 1901. It stood for revolution. It found an immediate following among those who didn't want to be compelled into anything, arbitration or prohibition, who wanted the simple dignity of deciding for themselves the way they conducted their own lives. It became the gathering place for those who swore, drank, and didn't go to church. A commonwealth of toil who were beginning to recognise their own worth, who wanted some of the respect cornered by respectable Auckland. And Tom Barker took to it. He got to know the secretary of the party, a brewery worker from Victoria in Australia, Michael Joseph Savage, whom he described as a gypsy-looking chap who was very knowledgeable on financial matters, though he was only a labourer in a brewery. Barker also became friendly with another Socialist Party officer, Peter Fraser, whom he described as a porky Scotsman, very well read. I had to look up porky. It means cunning, dry humour. I've described Fraser elsewhere as having a smile like moonlight flitting across a tombstone. Both Savage and Fraser believed capitalism would be overthrown by mass-based unions in concert with class-conscious political party. Savage would later become New Zealand's first Labour Prime Minister. Fraser would succeed him. The three of them, Barker, Savage and Fraser, became part of an inner-city cadre. Barker living in Brown Street off Ponsonby Road, Savage a few blocks away in O'Neill Street, Fraser over the other side of the Freeman's Bay Gully in a boarding house in Hobson Street over here, near the Socialist Party Hall. Barker had left a girl behind in England. She was a nurse in Colchester that he described as a very luscious-looking girl. He wrote to her to join him and paid the fares for her and a friend. It didn't last. He explained in his memoirs, somehow or other, due to my new, wild, hectic life, she thought I had changed. He put his energies into the Tramways Union, organising its labourers and arguing for a more militant line from the leadership. He was successful in both. In 1911, the union left the Auckland Trades and Labour Council and affiliated with the new Red Federation of Labour. Like the Socialist Party, Federation of Labour found anger and resentment and sought redress through strike action, and it boomed. In 1911, membership doubled. In 1911 alone, membership doubled. By 1912, it was up to 15,000 members, all of them supporting a federation openly calling for the overthrow of capitalism. There was another organisation, even further to the left, that was beginning to attract the Auckland worker. In 1911, a cocky and articulate Canadian had stepped off a liner from Vancouver. His name was John Bernard King, J.B. King. He'd worked as a miner, a driver, a stoker, knew his marks. He was an organiser of the industrial workers of the world, the IWW. The IWW, or Wobblies, argued for one big union, one big strike, and the world's wealth would fall like a peach into the hands of those who created it. It had reared up out of America's Wild West and took the Pacific as its patch. Vancouver, San Francisco, Sydney, Auckland. Its members passing, as Barker would later write, from land to land and from continent to continent with as little care as some men cross the street. Like the Red Feds, it argued for strike action, but it went further. It believed in scientific sabotage. Some of its members even hailed the invention of dynamite as a step forward in the class struggle. Talk softly and carry a big stick. It condemned left-wing spittoon philosophers and parliamentary lapdogs. It argued that the best way to agitate was on the job. The boss pays for your time. It warned fast workers die young. Somebody has to be the slowest. Let it be you. It proclaimed, on your feet is better than on your knees, but on your ass is best. In 1911, the Canadian J.B. King set about organising in inner-city Auckland and among the miners at Waihi. Both places were immediately receptive to his message. An IWW local was established in Auckland, and at Waihi, at social functions where God Save the King was sung, the top table began hearing verses coming back to them as God save our J.B. King, God save our J.B. King, God save J.B. King. There were strikes and wildcat strikes in the city's brand new moving picture palaces. Features were being shown aimed at portraying and appealing to the common crowd. A waif's Christmas, a thief by necessity, adaptations of Zola. Some were presented by the socialist showman Henry Haywood, all added to the ferment. It was a contagion among ordinary working people. To John A. Lee, it was the gathering momentum of the idea of the rejuvenation of society in a great strike. To employers, it was the conviction that the workers' ambitions knew no bounds. In December of 1911, Barker and the tramwaymen demanded a pay increase and threatened a stoppage. With Christmas and its packed trams pending, the Tramways Company capitulated. At the same time, the Auckland Local Bodies Labourers Union, led by Peter Fraser, lodged a set of wage claims after having already successfully struck in October. The Mayor declared that the city had to decide who was going to be the dominant force in Auckland, the council or, quote, revolutionary syndicalism in its worst form. Syndicalism is the political belief that all that's needed for the transfer of wealth from the ruling class to the working class is a general strike. The council gave a lead. It set about successfully creating and fostering its own yellow union of council labourers and thus splitting the workforce. Fraser and the Red Feds were thrown into confusion. They stormed a council meeting and rejected. The Red Feds and Socialists decided to defeat City Hall at the ballot box by running Michael Savage for mayor. Fraser then convinced the Socialist Party to veto the move, arguing Savage would simply be isolated by the right-wing council. The politics of it all was getting to Tom Barker. By early 1912, he had succeeded Savage as secretary of the Socialist Party that was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. In May, he resigned from the Socialist Party and announced he was joining the Wobblies. Last page. Barker's shift in allegiance coincided with the beginning of a period of the most intense industrial war leading up to the big strike of 1913. It's a tumultuous period, as Chris described it. The strike, of course, was lost. Ultimate success would have required a high degree of unity from the organised workers and division amongst opponents. Outside Auckland, that unity among the workforce didn't exist, while among the opponents of the strike, the bodies of the state, the big employers, the farmers, unity did exist, truculently so. For Michael Savage and Peter Fraser, the 1930 strike defeat and that of the Waihi strike the year before was the prelude to the birth of the Labour Party, an electoral party born out of retreat, a retreat that would continue remorselessly through the decades, even to the present. For others, that period of 1912 to 1930 was the birth of socialist politics in this country, the first flexing of a revolutionary potential capable of transforming society, which sounds like the end of a left-wing speech, capable of transforming society. One of those well-meaning phrases that you hear, capable of transforming society, trips easily off the tongue without too much intervention of the brain, full of hope and yearning, signifying nothing. But let's look at the Waihi strike the year before. That was a violent, murderous, 6-month strike at one of the biggest gold mines of the world. It was lost, but only just. Had the state not sent in the cops, the strike would have been won. What would then have happened? The Waihi Miners' Union, a revolutionary union body with revolutionary leaders, would have become the most influential union in New Zealand. The Red Federation of Labour would have moved even more sharply to the left and grown in power and influence. There would have been no strike in 1913, as the 1930 strike was fuelled by what had happened at Waihi. A Labour Party would have been formed, but one well to the left of that formed in 1916, and with North American IWW revolutionaries at its head rather than Australian moderates. This Labour Party would have probably taken office in the Depression, just as Michael Savage's party did, but it would have nationalised the banks and key industries, instituted workers' control of industry, put doctors on state salaries like teachers, told the British Royals to take a running jump, and sent food and arms to the Republicans fighting Franco in Spain. Our history could have been different because of that action at Waihi. Every strike has this potential to transform society. Every Unite picket outside McDonald's is brimming over with possibilities. That's why I said at the beginning that it's an honour to address Unite delegates. Thank you.